Welcome to my little winter wonderland under the cloche. We are going to be using the new IOD Noel Paint Inlay, and it has all sorts of really cute pieces to use. So I'm going to go ahead and take the Gingerbread Bakery as well as the bottom of this wonderful red holly and pine cone at the bottom there. I've already taken the liberty of cutting out the font from this bottom piece, okay? And I'm going to use the font, the fresh everyday gingerbread font up at the top. I'm going to cut the little gingerbread scene and drop it down so that it lands right smack in my cloche. And then I will go ahead and apply this guy on top, or at the bottom of the cloche to kind of fill it off and create this little scene in there. So the first thing that we have to do is kind of line things up the way we want them to be. And I know that I want the font to be up at the top. So we'll go ahead and snip that. Place that up at the top. I don't want it to be too much at the top. So I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that it stays a little lower. I don't think that I want the cakes and cookies piece inside my cloche, so I'm just gonna trim that off. I know that the cloche only stands so tall, so I'm going to kind of center this off and have roughly the same amount of space on either side. I'm eyeballing it, but that's 1 7/8 roughly on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and just assume that that's going to be the positioning of my cloche. And then I can go ahead and put these little bits inside, and it's okay if, you know, some of it gets cut off because it's a scene. You know what I mean? You can always pop in these little candy canes somewhere else if you want to. And then this is going to cover up a little bit of the bottom of the cloche anyway, so we really don't need to stencil the bottom portion of the cloche. We really just want to take advantage of the tops and sides. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do a base coat on this canvas. Just for the record, it is a 16 by 20 stretched canvas. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint that with a basic farmhouse white. Now, because we're doing a paint inlay, I want to make sure that I lay down my paint inlay directly into wet paint. So I need to have a general idea of where my cloche is so that I position this in the right spot, okay? So I've got my penciled in silhouette of the cloche. Now I'm going to go ahead, and let's actually make sure that it's tilted off a little bit to the side, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. So then I can go ahead and lay that down as well as this right into my wet paint, okay? So let's go ahead and do a fairly decent amount because you want this to be nice and wet and juicy so that your paint inlay has something to stick to. Okay, and now I can go ahead and rest this right into my wet paint. Kind of give it a gentle burnishing with your fingers. I'm using my mister here. And then I'm just going to very carefully burnish one more time to make sure that all of my letters are in contact with my canvas. I'm trying really hard to make sure that I'm not shifting the actual, the backing of the paint inlay. I really want this to stay put. So like I'm not pushing and spreading hard. And right now I'm just kind of coming in and doing a gentle pressure. And I'll apply the exact same technique for down here. Need a little bit more. And to be perfectly honest with you, probably would have been better to do the gingerbread scene first. But I didn't. So we'll just kind of work around it. Kind of carefully push this out. I'm trying really hard not to accidentally get paint on the back of my rice paper or carrier paper. Little blotting. Kind of gently smoothing out any of these wrinkles. You know, some wrinkles are fine, but some will completely change the look of your piece. So, you know, you just want to be mindful of those wrinkle placements. Careful you don't push too hard on your canvas. All right, and we'll go ahead and let that dry. When it comes time to remove your paint inlay carrier sheet, you want to make sure that you have the entire backing nice and wet. So I understand that you don't have font on the entire piece, but you really do want to reactivate the entire sheet of rice paper or carrier paper so that it can release the paint into the wet paint that you placed it into. Okay, so it has to be good and wet. So sometimes I just kind of take that first layer and then just sort of tap out some of the excess just to kind of make sure that everything is good and wet. And then I sort of start off in the corner and gently kind of remove to make sure that it's all gliding off. It should come off nice and neat. You shouldn't be having to work at pulling it up. If you do have to work at it, it means you need more water. You can go ahead and set that aside and dry that and use it again. Be careful that you don't accidentally wet that later on until we seal it. We'll go ahead and do the same thing to the bottom. And again, set that aside. You can reuse it again. Just lay it flat to dry. I'm going to go ahead and hit both of these with the heat tool and dry them up. Okay, so the next step is to cut just the right amount of gingerbread that's going to fit inside your cloche. So I'm just kind of laying this right on top, and I'm trying to optimize the height as much as possible on this. So again, just grab yourself your pencil or your pen and kind of sketch a line so you know where to cut. This way it'll fit nice and neat inside your cloche. And you still have those little candy canes, so if you decide you want to pop those in anywhere, you can. Just kind of keep in mind that, you know, it's not a transfer, so it's not like you can easily lay it on top unless you seal it. So you always have to be kind of careful and think 1 or 2 steps ahead when working with paint inlays. But the really beautiful thing about the paint inlays is they're part of your painting. They're part of your piece. So it's pretty cool in that you don't have anything that's going to potentially peel up or anything like that. I mean, if you do everything with the transfer, technically it stays put anyway. You don't have to worry about it. But, you know, hey, stuff happens. So let's go ahead and pop this in. I have a feeling some of my gingerbread tree house, that sort of thing, are going to sit on my pine, but I'm actually going to be laying snow down in this section anyway, so it's not going to bother me too much. Quickly make sure that it's right side up, that you don't want to shift too much, because you can totally make everything bleed underneath. It's not quite as easy to reposition. If you have to stick your hand behind the canvas to kind of keep it from bowing or pushing down, do that. Just, again, be really, really careful with the pine all around it, because your pine is not sealed. So it's going to bleed a little bit, okay? And I do have some bleeding, but again, I'm not freaking out about it. It's no big deal. I'm gonna put snow in here, so it's good. All right, so let's go ahead and dry that up, and then we'll reactivate it again. All right, carefully spritz this. I'm being mindful of my red pine. A lot. One more spritz. All right, lay your gingerbread flat. Got to get as many uses out of those as possible. Let's go ahead and dry this up completely. Okie dokie, so all of our piece is dry. Okay, we have all of the lovely font at the top, we have our cloche silhouette, and then we have that pretty base down at the bottom. Now we're going to take it outside and seal it. I like Workable Fixative. It's my favorite to seal with. It's something you can buy at Michael's, Joann's, Amazon. It's super, super easy to find. So Krylon, Grumbacher, there are a couple other brands out there, but really this is the best. So you just make sure that you get, you're supposed to kind of put it like a foot away, but I usually do about 3 to 4 inches off of the piece, and then just make sure that everything is really well covered, and then leave it flat to dry so that it doesn't run and it dries really quickly. Preferably on a hot day. You can't go wrong because it dries really fast. Okay, so I'm gonna run this outside and seal it. My piece is completely dried, and I've gone ahead and laid my stencil back on top. I'm taping it in place so it doesn't wiggle around. And the other thing that I'm gonna do, just so I don't accidentally stencil over my pine of any kind, is I'm just kind of taping off where the top of that pine hits, so the cloche essentially disappears behind the pine. That's the whole idea. So I'm just kind of coming in and blocking off where I do not want to get any of my paint. So I'm just kind of being very careful about that. If you've ever stenciled before, you know that less paint is best when it comes to your stippling or your brushing technique. I tend to like makeup brushes. They are just the right amount of sponge to suck up some of the color, and I'm just going to go really nice and soft. If you notice, all of the font on our paint inlay has a bit of an antique soft finish. That font up there was a soft gray. It wasn't a dark black. It was just very, very antique-y. So I'm trying to be mindful of not making this too stark of a black, okay? My color choice was a kind of graphite gray chalk paint. And like I said, I have very, very little paint on my sponge. Okay, carefully remove your stencil. You shouldn't have enough paint that it'll smudge. It should be nice and close to dry because you're using so little paint, okay? So there we have it. We have our cloche on top, and what's fantastic is that the gray is so similar to this gray in the font that it almost looks like the cloche was already part of this whole scene. So now we're gonna go ahead and dry up our acrylic, and we're gonna come in and add a little bit of antiquing. Okay, so you might decide that you like this to be really crisp white. Personally, I like things that are a little bit aged and imperfect, and because this font is kind of foggy and a little bit distressed, I think it just sort of adds to the whole vintage look and feel. So I'm just taking a little bit of a medium value brown and mixing it with some water, and I'm just going to kind of splat a few little antique-y looking spots in and around the entire piece. And then in a few of these areas, I'll rinse my brush and with water come in and kind of soften those little blobs of paint. This technique is called scumbling. Okay, so you know, you can even kind of fleck more paint directly into it. It just sort of adds to the antique appeal and feel of this entire piece. So don't just do it in one spot. Make sure that you kind of make it feel like the whole piece, the whole poster, the whole painting, whatever you want to call it, is a cohesive feel to it. So just sort of antique it wherever you want to. Having a very moist brush is pretty important when it comes to scumbling and splatter. So, you know, it just kind of takes a little bit of practice, but you'll get the hang of it. And anytime you're using an acrylic base like this, it's not going to reactivate. So it's pretty cool in that it's going to dry and you don't have to worry about it getting wet. So I am just going to finish this off. All right, go ahead and dry this up completely, and then we'll go ahead and add our snow. So all of my antiquing is nice and dry, okay? Now what I'm gonna do is go ahead and apply a top coat. And largely because I can see some of my paint lines The top coat is basically going to kind of help everything feel nice and smooth without having any weird lines from the different product I was using. And because we sealed this with the workable fixative, assuming that you did a decent amount on it, you should have no bleeding of any kind. That's one of the reasons why I typically try to be about 3 inches away from my canvas. That way I know for sure I have a really good application of the fixative. When you're done, just kind of do a quick back and forth to make sure that all your strokes are going in the same direction so that it dries nice and even. And we'll go ahead and dry that up completely, and then we'll go ahead and add our snow. The next step is Deco Art Snowtex. I love this stuff. It has the squishiest, most fun consistency, and it's got lovely grit and texture in it. So I'm just using my palette knife. I'm going to start off with less so I can kind of control where this is going to go. And I'm being very, very diligent about my placement because I know that I had some smearing from earlier on my red pine area. So I'm kind of just coming in and covering that up. And I want my little gingerbread scene to look like it's sitting in snow, as well as, you know, kind of some of it settled in and above my pine and my pine cones and that type of thing. Even my little gingerbread man's feet can kind of get covered in the snow. Then it doesn't look like they're just sort of floating, you know what I mean? The thicker it is, the longer it needs to dry. So, you know, if you want this to dry quickly, don't do super thick, but I think that the more textured and kind of clumpy, the more realistic it is in terms of snow. A little bit of snow at the top of the house. All right. So I'm going to stop there with the snow, but I am going to come in with a little bit of white chalk paint and splat a little bit. So I have that perfect melted milkshake consistency. Anywhere I need to kind of touch up, I can kind of just come in and stipple a little bit. I did varnish on top of this, so that might be a little bit of a challenge for its drying, but it should be fine. And this is all really subtle splatter. So you have all that really cool texture. A little bit of white splatter. But everything that looks like legit old, you know what I mean? So I'm gonna let that snow dry completely, and then I'm gonna go out and spray it one more time with my fixative just to kind of protect that snow from flaking off too much. You're gonna have a little bit of flake off, it's to be expected, but at least this way you're kind of helping stave off some of that crackling and whatnot, okay? So once I held this back, I quickly noticed that it felt very white. So I am going to add in a 1-inch border, basically just using painter's tape to kind of give me that perfect little edge. And I'm gonna go ahead and chalk paint with that same really, really nice slate dark gray color that I used for my cloche. So I'll do a 1-inch border all the way around this, and then I'll also paint my sides, and it'll give me the perfect framed finishing touch, and it should all look pretty good at that point. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and speed this along and show you the finished product. Hope you guys enjoyed this entire project. I had a blast with it, and I think you guys are gonna love the insanely million uses for the Roycycled Treasures Cloche, as well as the IOD Paint Inlay Noel. And I hope you guys have very happy holidays. I will see you guys next time. Bye.